I am joined by former Republican Governor Scott Walker from Wisconsin, who's been working with Vice President Pence to prepare for tonight's debate. Thanks for joining me.
Good afternoon. Great to be with you.
Good to have you. Last time around, there were many headlines that actually credited Mike Pence for doing quite well. What is your strategy tonight?
Well, we want him to be Mike Pence, and Mike Pence was good, I think, 4 years ago because he was calm, he was collected, he showed he was a successful Midwestern governor. I don't think the strategy changes dramatically, other than I think he's going to lean in on a few key issues, talking about the recovery, talking about the contrast not only with him and Senator Harris, but with former Vice President Biden. So I expect him to show a little bit more emotion than 4 years ago, but not to be markedly different in style. Still be that calm Midwesterner that I think earned him good credit 4 years ago.
One thing that came up, as you know, at the first presidential debate was Donald Trump's inability to just simply condemn white supremacy. You're advising Vice President Pence tonight. Can you do that right now?
Absolutely. I've done it for years as governor. Mike Pence has done it. I think he'll reaffirm that, particularly if the topic in question come up, as I think the president did after the debate, made it even clearer. But certainly Mike Pence will do that.
Understood. We wanted to check that. I don't think the president made it clear. As you know, that's been a roiling debate for some time, but I did want to get your answer on that. Turning to COVID, which is such a big issue, what is the point of the Trump administration having all this CDC guidance if the president himself doesn't follow it?
Well, I think it's really important, and I assume this will be discussed tonight. If you look back to March, when the scientists, Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, came in not only to Vice President Pence as the head of the task force, but to the president and others and said, we need to take action. We need to flatten the curve, where as many as 2.2 million Americans could die. They did. That's why we rushed to flatten the curve. We took the action necessary. And arguably hundreds of thousands of people were saved because of that. And while people may not always appreciate everything the president says or some of the actions he takes, in the end, the action this administration's taken on this has been strong. You contrast that with Joe Biden, who early on spoke out and ridiculed the president for closing down travel, and who on H1N1, the vice president's own chief of staff said he screwed it up.
I understand you want to get into H1N1 history, but the question specifically, and I could put on the screen, CDC says if you have COVID, you stay 6 feet away, you wear a mask, you stay home, preferably in one room. We're speaking tonight, and the president right now is violating those rules. Isn't that sending the wrong message and, more importantly, endangering people around him?
Well, he's not on public. This is a president who loves to go to rallies, who loves to be on public, who loves to talk to the American people, and he's not doing it for that exact reason. And again, I think it is important to contrast that with not just what's happening at this moment, but what this administration has done, and probably more equally, if not more importantly, what either of the candidates and the tickets would do going forward. Almost everything that we hear from Senator Harris and former Vice President Biden is really very similar, if not identical, to what this president and this administration have been doing and talking about. That's Governor, what the American people need to look at.
Let's get into the facts of that, because on the screen we have something everyone just lived through. You just said, well, the president loves to talk to people. This isn't about what the president loves. This is about his obligation as commander-in-chief. He went out on that ride in the SUV against his own CDC guidelines. Do not leave your house except to get medical care. And, you look more broadly and you say, the president breaks these rules, it puts people at risk. As someone involved in the team, doesn't that concern you? And what do you think the vice president, as leading the task force, should say tonight? If he, for example, and then I'll let you respond, if the vice president says on the stage tonight, and voters are watching, if he says it's very important that you follow the CDC guidelines and what the task force said, he will be, by definition, contradicting the president, Governor.
What would have put people at risk is failing to close down travel from places like China. Joe Biden ridiculed the president for doing that. The president acted on that. He took other action that literally saved hundreds of thousands of lives because he listened to what Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, and other scientists talked about. And I do think it's legitimate to contrast that, not only with what the ridicule he got from Joe Biden on the travel restrictions, but also on H1N1. Remember, 60 million people were infected with that. And Biden's own former chief of staff said it was only because of chance that this wasn't one of the largest mass casualty events in global history. There is a contrast between the two.
You get your time to hit that, and I'm sure the vice president will hit it tonight. You're a governor. You had responsibilities. Do you support contact tracing?
Hey, the bottom line is I've been wearing a mask since March, long before Democrat and Republican governors alike have. My wife's a type 1 diabetic. I take this seriously. I actually wear a Packers mask. They won't let me wear anything but this bland one here at the debate site. But I've been serious about this since day one. I think we can walk and chew gum. We can be healthy and at the same time have a healthy economy.
Well, respectfully, Governor, I hear you saying that. I have no reason to disbelieve you. I see you with your mask on. But you are advising Vice President Pence for the re-election of Donald Trump, where he rips his mask off. The CDC tells COVID patients you must tell close contacts about exposure. And as you know, and the headline's up on the screen, the White House isn't doing the contact tracing. That's not just about the modeling for the whole country. They're literally endangering people like yourself who work with them and show up at the White House. Isn't that wrong?
Well, the bottom line is I certainly wasn't close enough to stand up on the top of that point that he was at yesterday, nor was anybody else. We can talk all night about particulars about him, but what he's doing with the nation, with the policy, I think is the most important. And when you look at the scientists, we hear a lot about science. This president, this administration has listened to Dr. Fauci, listened to Dr. Birx, listened to other scientists who called for swift action, and they took it early on this year, and we saved lives because of that. We're going to continue to take swift action. And we're going to do it in a way that doesn't permanently cripple our nation's economy, which would be devastating to hundreds of millions of Americans, many of whom are out of work and need to get back to work again, and they will with this president.
As for Vice President Pence, who runs the task force, he said there would be no second wave. Basically, there wasn't a second wave. My question to you would be, do you know how many states have a mounting caseload right now?
Well, the bottom line is a variety of cases. In my own state, Wisconsin, we've seen an increase even after the face mask mandate, I should say. And that's because there's a variety of factors out there. We all need to do our part. We need to be in this together. As I mentioned, I've been talking about this personally since March because of my own situation and that of my family. But the actions that have been taken.
I understand, but just my job asking the questions, Governor.
I understand.
Do you know how many states are facing this kind of rising caseload, sir?
Well, I'm not the one in the task force. I'll leave that to the experts there. What I'm saying is I believe the vice president tonight needs to lean in. He shouldn't be on his heels. He should lean in on this and point out what this administration has done, not just what's talked about in the media, but what they've actually done, how they've listened to Dr. Fauci, how they've listened to other scientists, the actions they've taken. Contrast that with what Joe Biden said about ridiculing the president on China on restricting travel, and talk about what he did on H1N1.
You mentioned ridiculing.
We didn't have that mass fatality issue that even his own chief of staff from the past said that would have happened.
So we got you on record on that, but you said what's discussed in the media. And the point here, and you know this is a big issue with an administration that's been caught lying so much, is what we're discussing in the media, everything I've mentioned to you tonight, are facts. And these are the results of the policy. So the fact that I'll just mention 37 states have these serious or rising caseloads when Vice President Pence said in June there's no second wave is something people need to know. They need to assess that tonight and his ability to deal with that.
And I suppose. And he didn't know back then that Governor Cuomo was going to send COVID positive people to nursing homes. You look at New Jersey and New York alone, not only are they responsible for a huge percentage of the cases, but sadly, a major portion of the fatalities. The death rate per 100,000 is so much higher in New York and New Jersey because they failed the people of their state and in turn failed the people of this country. So
is that part of the argument tonight that you want Vice President Pence to say that because some of those regions that were hit first with higher density have those death counts, you're going to blame that on Democratic governors?
No, for your point, you raised the point about states. I think the vice president tonight's going to talk about defending the record of listening to the scientists like Dr. Fauci. He's going to talk about contrasting that with the horrible decisions that Joe Biden ridiculed on early on and his failed record when it came to H1N1 and the fact that it was only per chance, largely a miracle, that it was not much more worse in terms of the 60 million Americans who were infected with that disease. And then he's going to talk about other things as well. He's going to talk about the economy. He's going to talk about health care. He's going to talk about public safety. He's going to talk about issues that matter to people in my state and all across the country.
Yeah, and your state, Wisconsin, of course, is a key one. It was last time, and it's one that's been up for grabs. Governor, the other thing I want to ask you about, having gone back and forth on COVID, and I appreciate you having the dialogue on behalf of the campaign.
It's fun. I enjoy it.
Great. Well, you know, with the mask, I can't always tell.
These are big issues. These are important issues. Yeah. I'm smiling at that, right?
Yeah,
See,
I can't tell you
every
real
time I'm
quick.
happy, I'll just keeping up the Packers.
Real quick, I will ask you this in closing. In 2015, you said we don't need an apprentice in the White House, that Donald Trump took 4 projects into bankruptcy, and you called on other Republicans to find an alternative to him. Final question, sir. Now you're here, obviously tonight, advocating for him. Who was right? Scott Walker in 2015, who said any Republican would be better than Donald Trump, or Scott Walker today fighting for his reelection, sir?
I was wrong 5 years ago. I told Chuck Todd on this in the past and Meet the Press. I didn't think Donald Trump would govern as a conservative. I didn't think he'd be common sense, not having that track record. I was wrong. His regulatory reform, his tax cuts that benefit almost every American. You look at the other things that he's done have been wildly successful. And obviously, before this global pandemic, helped this country bring about the lowest unemployment rate we've seen in 50 years, the lowest ever recorded by category for African American, Hispanic American, Asian American, people with disabilities, and our veterans. I didn't think back then that he would be as successful in following through on those promises. He has been, and for that I'm very thankful, not for my party, but for my country.
Understood, and appreciate your candor, saying you think you were wrong last time. People will make up their own minds. Everyone's been able to watch the debate tonight. Governor Walker from Wisconsin, appreciate you coming on the beat, sir. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.